say it. Rosie Castro is the reason why I vote Democrat. You're the only reason. I'm telling you. And she was also the original member of the first Macondo Writers Workshop. So you're a Macondista, and we need you to come this summer to Macondo and speak, right? Will you do it? And you heard it here. Okay. So, all right. So you made the route thanks to one person. I'm going to ask you each the same question. Who was the person that altered your life? It was this guidance counselor that said you could study to be an educator at an Ivy League school.
It was my English teacher, Mrs. Dawn Swift. From the very, very beginning, she was the one who always said, she's the one who gave me Gary Soto's black hair. When I made the mistake of saying in front of her, why would I write about the details of the Central Valley? I want to write snow and pines y esto que el otro. And she said, no, what about the orchards, the vineyards? And I made that mistake. The next day, she came in with a copy of Black Hair by Gary Soto.
Wow, what a teacher.
Yeah.
Wherever you are, we thank those teachers that I have one too that changed my life. Otherwise, I would be, I don't know, but I wouldn't be here. That's for sure. Okay, I want to ask you some other things. Like, you went on from Harvard to go on to Cornell and study with the Chicana writer, the great writer, Elena Maria Villaramontes, who has this to say about you. She said, okay, you ready? She says, describing you in a recent profile as having, quote, a very radical talent with a sense of values that nobody can teach, a way of feeling injustice in his own bones and having the strength and morality to do something about it through literature. Wow.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
What do you have to say?
Well, I mean, she taught me how to do that. I mean, she's a wonderful person. I really thank my lucky stars that I had that wonderful moment of connection, to have a mentor at that level. I was, again, I think it's a lucky generation. We were part of a lucky generation where those people who were finally in those positions to mentor us at that level.
I remember when I first came to San Antonio, Texas in 1984, one of the first writers I brought in, Maria Villaramontes, and my colleague said, who's she? Oh no, we don't want her. I had to fight to bring Cherie Moraga, Elena Maria Villaramontes, Alberto Rios, everybody I brought, I had to fight. Mm-hmm. So she's your mentor. She opened the door for you.
Yeah.
And I'm going to teach you all something, wannabe writers and colleague writers. When you speak, always hold your book up. When they take your picture, do that. When you get on television, say, well, you know, Christiana Amanpour, I think because you cannot buy that kind of publicity. So we're going to say the consequences, Manuel Muñoz, and I forgot to read my blurb that's on the cover. Manuel Muñoz is a great American writer who sees with his heart as great as Juan Rulfo in writing about the poor. I wish I had written these stories, and that's not a lie. I wish that I had written these stories, but I didn't work in the fields. So one of the things you do in your book,
I was about to say,
that is so wonderful, is that you write stories that history forgot. And living in a town that is asking us to remember the Alamo, what are the stories that history forgot?
Well, in mine, it is how people have gotten from Mexico into the Valley, but also here in Texas. There's a Texas connection with some of these stories. My mom is from Mathis, Texas. And the first time I came here, I didn't realize how close Mathis was. And I rented a car and went immediately there to see the town.
You probably were the only tourist in Mathis, Texas.
Well, it was a great moment because I got on the phone. I said, Mom, guess where I am? And she remembered the streets and she was guiding me on the phone. Oh, vete pa allá. And over there is, there's the scene.
Right. There's the tasty food.
No, there's the one screen scene where your tia eloped with your tío. Like But those are the things, whether they're, their family histories or the roots and how they go from one place to another. That's really where my stories kind of connect.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. What is the thing you're proudest of, Manuel?
Oh, that my mom and my dad can hold the book in their hands, and that
Do they read your work?
they can't, because they got only up to the 3rd grade, and so they don't read in English. So one day when it gets translated into Spanish, that would be amazing.
Is it going to be translated into Spanish?
Not in the near future. Un día, we'll
But
see.
you can make the difference by buying the book and saying,
Oh,
"Where's
yeah.
the Spanish?" Right? If you ask for it, then they'll start breaking up.
Yeah.
Poco a poco.
Maybe individual stories, but not the whole book is what I'm hoping for.
How many more minutes do I have to chat before I have to introduce the next writer? My timekeeper. Huh? It's time to end it up. How quickly 10 minutes goes. But we're going to come back. If you have questions that you want to ask El Lindo Manuel Muñoz, author of The Consequences, we'll be right back. We're going to go to the next writer. Okay, thank you. All right, my next guest, I really do feel like Cristiana Amanpour, but my next guest is Reyna Grande, who I like to joke, I knew her when she was Reina Chica, because she used to come to San Antonio, and you used to come and read your first novels back in the day. I didn't know you that well. I knew of you. Didn't Gemini Inc. bring you? Yeah, that's right. You were here with your novels Across 100 Mountains and Dancing with the Butterflies. And then we met at the Miami Book Fair. And you were in the green room. And I think, did I offer a blurb or you asked for a blurb? A blurb is like the quote that's on the cover of the book that says, "This is the best thing since the corn tortilla." That's what that is. So you wanted a blurb. And I have to say the truth. This was the book that she was promoting. The book she was promoting is The Distance Between Us, a memoir. And when I read that book, I thought, wait a second, that's little Reyna Grande? How could she be writing a memoir? She has to be like 30 years old. No, you can't write a memoir when you're 30. But then I read the book, and I was flabbergasted. This was the book I had been waiting for. The first person account of crossing the border as an undocumented child. The first book that did that. We all know recently about Solito by Jose Javier Zamora. I always get mixed up because he has two first names. Jose Javier Zamora. But Reyna's came out 10 years ago. She has a new anniversary edition with an introduction that I wrote. And it's an amazing book. The second part of that, A Place Called Home. And now she has, like, if that isn't enough, that she writes novels, she's writing memoirs, and now she wrote a historical book. Where's your book?
I brought the Kindle.
No, hombre, I should have brought my copy. A Ballad of Love and Glory. And it's a historical book that takes place in Texas and in Mexico. And you're not even from Texas. No. So I love that the question that I'm going to do the reveal, the question that they asked her in Mexico at a conference, if you were not a writer, what would you be? She said, if I hadn't crossed the border, I would be a maid. Okay, Reyna Grande.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias, Sandra, por la invitación de estar aquí. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this beautiful morning in San Antonio. And it's such an honor to be here with you today. Yes, so I made the mistake of bringing my Kindle instead of my actual book. But I'm going to read you a little excerpt from, oh, there it is. Oh, thank you, Manuel. I'm going to read you an excerpt of A Ballad of Love and Glory, which takes place during the Mexican-American War, or as we should call it, the U.S. invasion of Mexico of 1846 to 1847 And this scene takes place when the US Army takes possession of Mexico City in 1847. The next day, the city was abuzz with the news that Santa Anna had broken his promise to the people to defend the capital to the bitter end, and instead had fled, taking with him his remaining troops. Coming out of the Catedral Metropolitana, Jimena watched as General Scott marched into the city to take possession of the Palacio Nacional. She couldn't bear the sight of the invaders. Sitting atop a magnificent horse and surrounded by his escorts, Scott made his way past the citizens who watched his entrance into the palace in horror. On the eve of Mexican Independence Day, the flag of stars and stripes unfurled in the wind in full view of the city, to the sorrow of the Mexican people. Jimena remembered the first time she saw that flag at the Yankee encampment across from Matamoros. Who would have imagined then that from Matamoros, it would go on to fly over other Mexican cities until it ended up here, piercing the heart of Mexico. Now Jimmy was dead, and so were many of the San Patricios. John was in prison, and Santa Anna had abandoned the city that he claimed to love. She was alone, about to bring forth a child into this unstable world. Watching the Yankee colors floating over the Palacio Nacional, she knew that the demoralization of the Mexican soul was complete. Something snapped inside her at the same moment that a change happened in the crowd. Perhaps it was seeing the enemy's flag flying over the palace that woke the people from their culpable apathy. They realized that with Santa Anna's army and the government officials gone, no one was coming to defend them. Perhaps it was the realization that instead of celebrating their country's independence, they were watching Mexico return to its days of conquest, back in the hands of invaders. Even stones would have been better than nothing, Santa Anna has said to her the night before. Jimena picked up the stone by her shoe and hurled it at the Yankee soldiers marching by. Others did the same, raising the cry for war, raining stones and bricks upon the invaders. A stormy riot broke out. The people, even the beggars, the lepers, and the peddlers, weaponless but full of indignation and hungry for revenge, fought with whatever they could, yelling, "Muerte a los Yankees! Muerte a Santa Anna!" Then others joined in, and from the rooftops and windows of the nearby buildings, they discharged their escopetas upon the enemy. The Yankees fell into ranks, loaded and fired their cannons upon the multitude. The crowds ran for cover, and Jimena barely kept herself from being trampled by the fleeing masses. Clutching her protruding stomach, she reached the doors of the Catedral Metropolitana just as another cannon blast exploded outside. Thank you.
I have to tell you that Reyna does not make her living as a profesora. She doesn't have an affiliation with health insurance. Good girl. Good job. She is one of those rare things, a freelance writer that makes her living from doing presentations at high schools and grade schools, community centers, book fairs. She's on the road a lot like me. And there's very few of us. You're the only other one I know that makes her living from her pen. And it's not easy, and it's not glamorous. And we recently were together. She, at my invitation, went to where she had gone to school, her alma mater, University of California, Santa Cruz, and drove me there. And after the book signing and the lecture was over, the hard part about being a writer, trying to find food after 11 o'clock. And we wound up at 5 minutes to 11 at the IHOP. And they didn't want to sell us pancakes. And we said, please, please, we'll take it to go. And they let us take it to go. And we had no place to eat it but my hotel room that only had a little like table that was like that. And we were sitting with plastic forks and styrofoam eating our Grand Slam. And I looked at her and I said, this is our glamorous life.
Yep.
So I know you have to be away. You have 2 children and a husband.
Yes.
You're away a lot. Tell me about that life you live.
Yeah, well, it's kind of difficult because, as you know, I mean, trying to be a mom, trying to be a wife, and trying to have a writing career, it's a lot to juggle. But I have been very fortunate because my husband is very, very supportive. He also...
That's rare.
Yeah, it is rare. And he supports me a lot. And he never gives me any grief about me, going out into the world to promote my work. He holds down the fort while I'm gone, and he takes care of the kids, and he just feeds them, Cheerios the whole time I'm gone. But at least they're being fed and taken care of. So.
And your books are required reading, like mine, at high schools, middle schools. This new one, I don't know how it's going to be received. I hope it gets banned. Because if it gets banned, you cannot buy that kind of publicity, right? That's why you want your book to get banned, and then you want it to return on the shelf.
Yeah, we gotta get the Texas governor to ban my book.
Yeah.
Let's start
if it got banned, then everybody make world news, right? So plus there's a lot of stuff in there that's kind of I think the Daughters of the Republic might get a little upset. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So A Ballad of Love and Glory features a Tejana from San Antonio. Jimena is from this area, and her family participated in the Texas Rebellion, and they allied themselves with the Anglo rebels.
Is she a real person, though?
She's a fictional character that was inspired by a poem written by John Greenleaf Whittier in 1847. It's called The Angels of Buena Vista. And the poem is about the Mexican soldaderas who were out in the battlefields. And this poem is about a woman named Jimena who's in a battlefield tending to the wounded. And when I found that poem, I took Jimena from that poem and then I made her into my... And my male protagonist is John Riley, who was the leader of the St. Patrick's Battalion. And he is a historical figure. The St. Patrick's Battalion was a unit in the Mexican Army that was composed of deserters from the U.S. Army, and most of them were Irish. And John Riley was an Irishman from County Galway, and he decided to help Mexico defend itself against the invaders. And these Irishmen were doing it at the risk of death because desertion was punishable by death. And in fact, 50 of them were hanged by the U.S. Army in Mexico City. So it's a true story woven in with some fiction, but it's a war story, it's an immigration story, and it's a love story.
And I think there are still descendants of those Irishmen.
The San Patricios, yes.
Because there's a lot of redhead Mexicans, freckle-faced Mexicans, and if you did their DNA, I bet it would show that they're the descendants of the San Patricio Brigade.
Yes.
Right? All right, so I have a couple of questions. First, is that camera catching you? Because if not, I'm going to move one over. Do you think? Yeah, we got it? Okay, good. I was just worried. Okay, good. All right. Well, a lot of things in this historical novel is a little bit scary because I didn't realize that the U.S. Army treated the Irish, the German, all of the mercenaries like trailer trash. They treated them really bad, and they punished them and tortured them. Is that true?
Yeah. I mean, the descriptions that I put here about the punishments that the Irish, the Germans, the Italians, the Polish, Scotsmen, I mean, the way that they were treated in the U.S. Army is horrible. And of course, during the 19th century, the Irish were the least desirable group of immigrants that were arriving in the United States. So they faced a lot of ethnic discrimination. They faced a lot of religious prejudice because they were Catholic. And when they were in the US Army, they were mistreated, they were abused by nativist officers. And so one day, John Riley, after witnessing all of this abuse, he had enough and he threw himself into the Rio Grande and swam south, and he joined up with the Mexicans.
Didn't also black slaves desert and come into Mexico for the same reason?
Yes, well, for them it was a little different because once the U.S. Army came to the Rio Grande region, as you guys know, Mexico had abolished slavery many years before. So as soon as an enslaved person crossed the river and they set foot in Mexico, they were free. And so some of them started also swimming across the river to get down to.
And we have communities in Mexico, certain towns
Right.
that are black communities where the music is very different than anywhere else on both coasts.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of mixing of the blood that doesn't get mentioned in Mexican history. That's another story that history forgot about the mixed race people of Mexico.
Yeah. And there was also an underground railroad to Mexico. I know we always talk about the underground railroad here going north, but there was one going south too, to Mexico.
Wow. That's another novel you have
Yes.
to write. What is the thing you learned essentially from writing this book? It's a lot of work to do a historical novel. What could you share with people out there that want to do their own historical novel?
To take it in phases, because I got overwhelmed. It took me 7 years to write this novel. And at first I got really overwhelmed by all the history and trying to learn everything. And I couldn't sit down to write a single scene without first doing a lot of research. But then eventually I realized that I just needed to know enough to write a first draft of the scene. And then later I could go back and start adding more details. So that's how I started to not be so overwhelmed by this novel. But one thing I really wanted to do with the story was to not manipulate it, not distort it, not romanticize it, because that's how we get taught U.S. history in school. And I didn't want to do that in my novel. So I tried to be as accurate as I could. I try to stick to all the historical events as they unfolded. And I put in my plot into the historical timeline instead of trying to fit the history into my plot.
How many minutes do we have left? Okay, well then we have to wrap up here. You can ask Reyna more questions. She makes her living doing adaptations of her own and other people's books into young adult version. And I can't wait for the young adult version to come out so we can use it in the schools, because this one has some very steamy scenes, So you might want to read it just for that. Thank you, Reyna.
Thank you. Thank
Hi,
you, everybody.
Thank you. Okay. Now, probably the writer up here who I've known the longest is Reggie Scott Young, who back in the day when we were both Chicago writers, we worked together on a community workshop called City Songs, among other work that we've done together. And I left Chicago, and a couple years later, he left, went to many different places, but he made a very circuitous route into the academic. He had bus tables instead of going into trying to be a PhD, but we'll talk about that. I want him to read his poetry first. He's working on a book that's set in San Antonio, but I want him to read his first book, because the book he's working on, we can talk about. Reggie Scott Young.
Thank you. He hates my guts. And he was raised as a Huxtable kid, but for whatever reason, things were never good enough, never had enough, even though he had the first Game Boy the day it came out, and so forth and so on. And I'm sorry. So it's made me think about my relationship with my father, which was not the best, but I never hated him. Later on in life, I came to appreciate him more and understand the difficulties, especially for men in marginalized communities, men who are working class, what they go through, what they had to go through in order to make us into the people that. It's hard to do this without a podium, holding a microphone. I lost my page. I'm sorry, but I want to read a poem that is about him, and it's called. I'm sorry, I can't find it now. Excuse me. I lost the page. I got it. I'm sorry. It's called Home Riots, and you should know, even though it comes up later in the poem, that Martin Luther King once said that a riot is the language of the unheard. Most Saturday nights, he'd come up from the garage by 10, stalking like a grease monkey, while one by one we'd take our dips in the tub. His presence shooting chills up bare spines, much like the zombies we'd later see after sneaking up for a peek at Shock TV, more frightened by his presence than by rampaging monsters, sedated either by our mother's tranquilizing call or the fuming scent of his own black label, and our walls would be left standing with no holes punched through them. That was the only time we'd see him, except during our between services supper on Sunday afternoons. He'd be sitting there when we'd arrive back home, eyes tightly slitted, an open bud teetering in, nodding fingers. He wasn't a stepdad to us, although at times we'd wonder if he was more of a real dad to the little Ishmaels everybody knew he had running around, and if he was more to them like the fathers we'd see on shows like Family Affair and My Three Sons. But he was a man who stuck around and always came back from the sojourns he would take in search of manhood or fortune, or maybe just to find his song. And he never confused his blues for anyone else's. He was more of a revolving rock than a rolling stone. He married himself to the slave that he had, punched a janitorial clock from 5 till night, cleaning the mess civilization and his people make every day. But he carried on an outside affair with a hydraulic jack in our alley, came home to work on his boss's cars, getting paid in thanks but not money, earning compliments as tips, quips about creditors, and knowing that tomorrow his time card would still be there. So he'd come upstairs late, sleep in those dirty and grease-stained overalls, snore louder than roosters crow, even waking up alley dogs before their time. And that's why in the middle of the night, he lived in dreams what Martin Luther King said was the language of the unheard. But being too young to know political science, only judge his screams and the violence in his fingers and eyes as him being mean. Thank you.
When I first read these poems, first I had to ask Reggie, what is a yard bird? You could tell him the city. Yardbirds Squawking at the Moon is the title of your book. And what's a yard bird?
It's a chicken in the country. You get hungry, you go out and you grab a yardbird by the neck, you break it off, and you...
Well, I never had a yardbird in Chicago.
Right.
Well, your work is set in so many different places because you were born in Louisville.
I was born in Louisville, yes.
Raised in the neighborhood I was born in, Lawndale in Chicago. Then you moved to Villanova when you were a professor scholar. Then you moved to Louisiana, and now you live over by Mission Concepcion here on San Antonio. Talk about that journey and how it's reflected in your writing.
Well, it's a journey in Americana, and growing up, I never wanted to leave Chicago. I mean, I was fiercely loyal. We were community poets, and so I was Chicago. But being a college professor is like in the BA or something, that you go where you're drafted to work. You don't graduate college as a basketball player and then move to LA and say, I'm going to play for the Lakers. No. So I worked in Virginia, Central New York, all over the country. But doing so gave me a very different perspective of this country and the various people in it. And especially people today who call themselves things like MAGA, this and that, because I've lived around them and I have a very different perspective of them and what their plight is compared to if I had never left a big city and had only known about them from stories on the news.
Well, speaking about those moves, now you live by Mission Concepcion, which is considered the South Side, and you're writing about Texas now. Can you talk about your project, what you're working on now?
Sure. Well, years ago, when I was at the University of Louisiana, I came to a conference here in San Antonio, was at the Gunther Hotel, and saw a plaque outside a room that I actually read in saying Robert Johnson recorded here. I said, what? And I asked about it, and most people know who Robert Johnson is. And if you don't know who he is, Robert Johnson was not well known during his life, but later he was discovered by the Cream, Clapton, Mick Jagger, and others. In the early songs in rock and roll were Robert Johnson songs. The movie Crossroads that the Karate Kid starred in was based on Robert Johnson's legend that he supposedly sold his soul to the devil for his talent. And after a couple of years, the devil took him at the crossroads. So I wanted to bring Robert Johnson. I'm a comic book nerd, and I watch comic book movies. And so just thinking about portals and time portals and travel, that he comes out of the crossroads in 2023 in San Antonio. So what would that be like? What would it mean? And that's where this project originates, with this blues figure showing up in our city and me trying to explore what his experiences would be like, and also the experience of those around him.
What's the name of this manuscript?
The working title is Searching for Robert Johnson at the Alamo Dome.
And who funded this award? Who gave you the award, in other words?
Last year, a year ago, there was a call for applications for San Antonio individual artist grants. And like with the NEA and other grants, you apply and they award it to you based on the merit of your writing. Well, this one, you had to present a project. And that's what came to mind. How could I write about San Antonio as an outsider? Well, the best way would be to write about and through someone who is an outsider. So my Robert Johnson figure is an outsider to San Antonio, and it opens a window for me to explore San Antonio experience, San Antonio history, and also a much underrepresented area of San Antonio in literature and everything, and that's the East Side.
How do you research somebody like Robert Johnson, who lived here and died so young and lived on the East Side?
Well, there are a number of books about him. Most are not very good because they present him as a stereotypical figure. So I have to humanize him. I don't want to use blues cliches. I don't have them talking and that kind of lingo that you see in old movies. The Carver Library here has been support and the librarian D.L. Grant, because it has a number of resources that I never knew existed about San Antonio African American history, about the history of San Antonio. And so it was just a matter of me learning more about this history and imagining Johnson from perspective.
One of San Antonio Ford's writers is low overhead. That's why I lived here for so long. When you want to write a book, you need low overhead, not spending your money on high rent and high meals. That's why a lot of artists and musicians especially have come from San Antonio, don't you think? So we only have 3 minutes left. So I want to ask you, what's the challenge of being an outsider living in San Antonio, writing a book of poetry, or it's prose?
It's poetry
It's a
and
novel.
prose. It's multi-genre. Okay. I think the challenge, there's a reason why there are writers' colonies, so you can get away. And writing in San Antonio, for me, is challenging because I live in a barrio. In Chicago, I met Sandra when I worked for Latin American Cultural Center. So it's not, wasn't a natural or bad situation for me to move into a largely Mexican American neighborhood here. But, you know, people like to play their music loud, and, you know, people like to live. So I can't complain about it, but sometimes it can be challenging to work in a place where you live and the place that you want to write about.
I know we have to wrap up, but I want to say you are writing a very difficult book about forgotten history in San Antonio, where we are asked to remember things we don't want to remember. So I want to thank you, Reggie, for tackling a subject as a non-native of Texas, non-native of San Antonio, and bringing the East Side. Because when I moved here, I said, where are my Black brothers and sisters? Why are they divided by that interstate? And I thank you for doing that work.
Well,
So Reggie Scott Young, buy his book of poetry.
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you, Sandra Cisneros, Reyna Grande, Manuel Muñoz, and Reggie Scott Young. One final round of applause.
I think we ran out of time, right? So you'll have to go and ask them the questions directly. They'll be at their booths. But I want to thank you for doing work of unity and peace, supporting this book fair. Thank you.
Thank you. And as a reminder, book sales and signings will take place 15 minutes from now at the Nowhere Bookshop tent outside in the Festival Marketplace. The next event will be coming